5 swords were already drawn before the Omega girls stepped into the courtyard, and not one of the men holding them expected to be on the ground within the minute. Steel rang against stone. Torches guttered against a black, moonless sky. And in the center of the Alpha King's own training yard, Brynn stood with her wrists still raw from rope burn, her lips split, her hands empty of any weapon at all. The guard captain, a broad man named Tobias who had spent 15 years breaking the will of stronger wolves than her, spat at her feet and laughed. "An Omega who can't fight," he said. "That's what they call you, isn't it?" The court's favorite joke. Brynn said nothing. She rolled her shoulder once, slow, like a woman stretching before a nap rather than a fight for her life. Behind Tobias, for more guards fanned out in a loose circle, boots crunching against gravel, grins on their faces like they had already been promised a story to tell at the tavern that night. The one called Fenric was still chuckling when Brynn moved. By the time the bells in the eastern tower finished their third toll, all 5 men were on their backs, and the Alpha King of the Northern Hold was standing in his own doorway, staring at the wreckage of his personal guard, utterly speechless. By morning, there would be a bounty on her head. By nightfall, the entire kingdom would know her name. But 6 months earlier, nobody in that castle could have told you Brynn's name at all. She was the girl who scrubbed floors and flinched at raised voices. She was nothing. She was no one. She was, as far as anyone in Caldrith Hold was concerned, exactly what an Omega was supposed to be. This is the story of how that changed. Chapter 1. Caldrith Hold sat on the edge of the Iron Cliffs, a fortress of gray stone that had weathered 3 centuries of winters and 2 wars nobody living remembered starting. It was ruled, as it had been for a decade, by Alpha King Roran, a man the pack both feared and adored in roughly equal measure, mostly because he gave them very little reason to do either. He was fair in his judgments, cold in his private life, and famous throughout the Northern Territories for a single, unbreakable rule. No wolf raised a hand against another within the walls of his hold unless sanctioned by combat law. Break that rule, and it did not matter who you were. You answered to him, personally, and he was not known for mercy. It was a good rule, Brynn often thought, right up until it became the reason she had to hide exactly what she was for 11 years. She had been 6 years old when her father died. She did not remember most of it. She remembered the smell of smoke, and she remembered a woman she never saw again pressing a folded piece of leather into her small hands and telling her to run and not look back, no matter what she heard. She had run. She had not looked back. And when the pack scouts found her 3 days later, half-starved and unable to say who her parents were, they had done the kindest thing they knew how to do for an orphan with no scent mark of any bloodline. They had registered her as an Omega, the lowest rank in wolf society, and sent her to the kitchens. For 11 years, that was Brynn's entire world. Wake before dawn. Haul water. Scrub the same stone floors that had probably been scrubbed by Omegas since before the Iron Cliffs had a name. Keep her eyes down. Keep her voice quiet. Never, under any circumstances, let anyone see her as anything other than what her rank said she was. It should have been easy. It was not, because the folded leather bundle her mother had pressed into her hands 11 years ago had not been empty. It had been a training manual, hand-annotated in a strong, slanted script, and hidden beneath the 3rd floorboard of the servants' quarters. Brynn had spent every night of her adolescence teaching herself to fight from a dead man's handwriting. Her father, she had come to understand through years of half-remembered fragments and careful, dangerous questions, had not been an ordinary wolf. The forms in that manual were not the forms taught to Caldrith's guards. They were faster. meaner. Built for someone smaller fighting someone bigger, which was, Brynn supposed, with the kind of dry humor that had gotten her more than one cuff round the ear from the head cook, extremely convenient. Come on, girl. The head cook, a broad and perpetually irritated woman named Peg, would say most mornings. You've got flour on your face, and your head somewhere else entirely. Where do you go at night that leaves you this tired? Nowhere, Brynn said. I simply don't sleep well. You don't sleep at all, from the look of you, Peg replied, squinting at her. If I didn't know better, I'd say you were sneaking out to meet a boy. Brynn had nearly choked on her own spit at that. If you knew what I actually did at night, she said, you'd wish it was a boy. Peg had laughed so hard she'd had to sit down. That was the rhythm of Brynn's life. Invisible by day, dangerous by night, and sharp-tongued in the brief hours where the two overlapped and nobody was paying close enough attention to notice. She had made exactly one true friend in all her years at Caldrith, a fellow kitchen Omega named Sable who was, in Brynn's private opinion, the only person in the entire hold with a sense of humor worth respecting. You know what your problem is, Sable told her once. Elbow deep in dishwater. You've got a face like you're perpetually one insult away from murdering someone, and half the guards think it's funny. It's not funny, Brynn said. It's a coping mechanism. Sure. Keep telling yourself that when Fenric calls you an Omega who can't fight for the 100th time, and you just stand there smiling like a woman who knows something he doesn't. I do know something he doesn't, Brynn said. What's that? That someday I'm going to break his nose, and it is going to be extremely satisfying. Sable had laughed then too, the way she laughed at most of Brynn's darker jokes, without ever quite believing them. Nobody believed them. That, Brynn had decided long ago, was the entire point. The guards of Caldrith Hold had a particular fondness for tormenting the Omegas, and Brynn most of all. She was too quiet, too sharp-eyed, too unwilling to grovel in the specific, performative way that made bullies feel powerful. Tobias, in particular, had taken a dislike to her from the moment she'd first failed to flinch when he shouted at her over a spilled tray. Something wrong with you, girl, he had said once, looming over her with the easy cruelty of a man who had never once had to consider the possibility of consequences. You don't scare right. I scare fine, Brynn had said. I just don't see the point in doing it for your entertainment. He had cuffed her for that, hard enough to split her lip, and she had stood back up slowly, wiped the blood away, and looked at him with an expression that made even Tobias pause for half a second before he laughed it off and walked away. She had gone back to the servants' quarters that night, pulled up the third floorboard, and trained until her arms shook, because the alternative was thinking about how badly she had wanted, in that moment, to put him on the ground. Not yet, she told herself, the way she told herself every night. Not yet. Not yet. The trouble with living by not yet for 11 years is that eventually something arrives that will not wait. Before we continue, I'd like you to let me know in the comment section where you are currently watching the story from. Also, do not forget to like and hit the subscribe button for more interesting werewolf romance stories. Chapter 2. Alpha King Roran had a headache that had lasted approximately 6 months, and its name was the Thornvale Conspiracy. It had started small. A missing shipment of iron. A poisoned well in a border village that everyone assumed was an accident until the well beside it was poisoned too. A pattern of small, deniable cruelties that, taken individually, meant nothing, and taken together, meant someone inside his own hold was working very carefully to destabilize him. His beta, a lean, watchful man named Garen, had been the one to bring him the first reports. Someone is testing you, Garen had said, laying a map across the war table, red ink marking 3 separate incidents in the span of 2 months. Testing how you respond. Testing what you notice. Testing for what purpose? Roran had asked. Garen had spread his hands in the universal gesture of a man who did not yet have an answer he liked. That, my king, is the question that keeps me awake. Roran did not sleep well either, though for reasons that had less to do with conspiracy and more to do with the particular, grinding loneliness of ruling a hold that both needed him to be untouchable and resented him for being exactly that. He was 32 years old. He had inherited the throne at 22, buried his father and 2 older brothers within the same brutal winter, and had spent the 10 years since learning that the crown weighed considerably more than anyone had warned him. He was also, by the near-universal agreement of every unmarried woman of rank within 3 territories, an extremely eligible bachelor, a fact that amused him roughly as much as it exhausted him. Chief among his admirers was Odessa, daughter of a wealthy border lord, who had installed herself at Caldrith Hold for the better part of a year under the thin pretense of a diplomatic visit and made absolutely no secret of her intentions. "You work too hard," she told him one evening, draping herself elegantly across the chair opposite his desk uninvited, the way she did most evenings. A king needs balance. Distraction. Someone to remind him he's still a man and not simply a title. "I have plenty of distractions," Roran said, not looking up from his correspondence. "Most of them are trying to poison my wells." "That's precisely my point," Odessa said. "All the more reason you need someone soft in your life, to balance out all the sharp edges." Roran had looked up at that, one eyebrow raised. "Soft is not a quality I am currently short on advice about," he said dryly. "I have several advisors telling me to be softer, several telling me to be harder, and not one of them able to agree on which particular problem requires which particular approach." "Then let me simplify it for you," Odessa said, leaning forward. "Be soft with me, and hard with everyone else." Roran had made a noncommittal sound and returned to his letters, and if he had been a slightly less disciplined man, he might have laughed outright at how transparently that woman wanted a crown more than she wanted him. It was, in fact, on one of those long evenings of correspondence and quiet, grinding worry, that Roran first noticed the Omega girl who did not act like an Omega at all. He had gone down to the kitchens himself, unannounced, because his cook had a habit of leaving out bread and cold meat for him when he worked past midnight, and habit had worn a groove that even a king occasionally followed. He had not expected to find a girl standing in the dark, alone, moving through a set of forms that no kitchen Omega had any business knowing. She had not seen him at first. He had watched, silent, from the doorway, as she moved through a sequence that was fast, low, and precise, aimed at targets far larger than herself, footwork built for someone who expected to be outsized in every fight she ever had. Then she had turned, seen him, and gone rigid with the specific, total stillness of someone who has just realized they are caught. She had not screamed. She had not dropped to her knees and begged forgiveness, which was, in his considerable experience, the standard reaction to being discovered by the Alpha King in the middle of the night. She had simply stood there, chin lifted, waiting to see what he would do. "What's your name?" he had asked. "Brynn, my king," she had said, her voice steady in a way that struck him as strange for a girl who had every reason to be terrified. "Where did you learn that?" "I taught myself," she had said, which was, he would later realize, both entirely true and carefully incomplete. He had studied her for a long moment. "Do it again," he had said. She had blinked at him. "My king?" "The form." "Do it again." She had hesitated only a second before obeying, and Roran, who had trained with the finest weapons masters in the Northern Territories since he was old enough to hold a blade, had watched an Omega kitchen girl move through a sequence with a precision that would have earned respect from any guard captain in his employ, and felt something shift, quietly, in the back of his mind. He had said nothing to her about it. He had simply told her to go back to bed, watched her go, and then stood alone in his kitchen for a long time, turning over a single, uncomfortable question. If a girl with no rank and no name could move like that in secret, what exactly did she have to hide, and from whom? He did not have an answer. He had, however, quietly instructed Garen to keep a discreet, distant eye on the girl called Brynn, and then filed the entire strange encounter away under problems for later, because the Thornvale conspiracy was not going to solve itself, and a talented kitchen girl, however curious, was not currently at the top of his list of concerns. He would come to regret that particular ranking of priorities rather badly. Chapter 3. The trouble began, as trouble so often does, with a rumor that was almost entirely untrue. Someone, likely one of the younger guards who had noticed Roran's late-night visit to the kitchens without understanding a single thing about what he had actually seen, had started whispering that the Alpha King had taken a personal interest in the Omega girl called Brynn. By the time the rumor had traveled its full circuit through the guard barracks, it had transformed from a vague, second-hand observation into a fully formed and thoroughly embellished tale in which Brynn had, depending on who was telling it, either seduced the king, spied on the king, or attempted to poison the king and been caught in the act. None of it was true. All of it made her life considerably worse. Tobias, in particular, took the rumor as a personal insult, the way he took most things that suggested an Omega might be worth more attention than himself. "Word is you've been keeping the king company at odd hours," he said one afternoon, cornering her in the kitchen courtyard with 3 of his usual companions trailing behind him like a poorly trained pack of hounds. "Didn't take you for the ambitious type, or the type men bother with, frankly." "Careful," Fenric said, grinning. "She might poison your dinner next." "I don't cook for guards," Brynn said evenly, arms folded. "I only clean up after them. There's a difference, though I understand the distinction might be difficult for you." Fenric's grin faltered slightly. Tobias laughed, but it was not a friendly sound. "You've got a mouth on you for someone with no rank," he said. "Someone ought to teach you what that mouth is worth." "I'd love to see them try," Brynn said, and immediately regretted it, because the words had come out sharper and more certain than 11 years of careful invisibility should have allowed. Tobias's eyes narrowed. For a long moment nobody moved. "Is that a challenge?" he said quietly. "It's an observation," Brynn said, forcing her voice back into something closer to bored indifference, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she was fairly certain the entire courtyard could hear it. "You seem very confident for a man who has never once had to actually prove anything." She had walked away before he could answer, spine straight, hands steady, and had not allowed herself to shake until she was 3 corridors away and safely alone. That should have been the end of it. It was not, because 2 nights later, Odessa, who had heard her own version of the rumor and taken it considerably more seriously than the truth deserved, decided the Omega girl needed to be reminded, publicly, exactly where she stood. It happened in the Great Hall, during the evening meal, in front of nearly the entire hold. Odessa had summoned Brynn forward under the pretense of a spilled goblet of wine that needed cleaning, and then, once Brynn was kneeling in front of the head table with a cloth in her hands, had spoken loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "I understand you've been getting rather comfortable around here," Odessa said, her voice sweet and caring. "Sneaking around at night, getting ideas above your station." I do hope someone has explained to you what happens to Omegas who forget their place. Brynn had kept her eyes on the floor, on the spilled wine soaking into stone, and said nothing, because 11 years of careful invisibility had taught her exactly one lesson above all others. Silence cost nothing. Pride cost everything. It might have ended there. Silence and spilled wine, and a room full of people pretending not to watch, if Tobias had not chosen that exact moment to add his own contribution. "Don't waste your breath, my lady," he said, loud enough to draw a ripple of laughter from the guards at his table. "An Omega who can't fight isn't worth the warning. She knows exactly what she is." The laughter spread. Brynn knelt there, cloth still in her hand, wine soaking into the knees of her dress, and felt something in her chest go very still and very cold, the way the surface of a lake goes still right before ice forms. She did not look up. She did not say a word. She finished cleaning the wine, rose, curtsied with a precision so perfect it bordered on mockery, and walked out of the hall with her head held high while the entire room laughed behind her. She made it exactly as far as the servants' corridor before she allowed herself to stop shaking, and it was there, alone in the dark, that Sable found her 20 minutes later. "I heard," Sable said quietly, "no jokes this time. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Brynn said, which was, they both understood, an outright lie. Sable studied her for a long moment. "You know," she said carefully, "for someone who's spent 11 years being the most patient person I've ever met, you've got a very particular look on your face right now. The kind of look that makes me want to ask what exactly you've been doing with all those nights you don't sleep." Brynn met her friend's eyes and, for the first time in 11 years, considered telling the entire truth. She didn't. Not yet. But something in her had shifted that night, quiet and permanent, the way a hairline crack shifts a stone wall long before anyone notices it's about to come down. If they wanted to keep calling her an Omega who can't fight, she thought, staring at her own reflection in a dark window, then perhaps it was time somebody found out exactly how wrong they were. Chapter 4. The plan, insofar as Tobias and his companions had won it all, was never meant to be a plan. It was cruelty, dressed up as a lesson, born from wounded pride and too much ale and the particular, dangerous stupidity of men who had never once been made to answer for anything. They caught her 3 nights later, on her way back from the well, in the same courtyard where, 6 months earlier, Roran had first watched her train in secret. There were 5 of them: Tobias, Fenric, and 3 others whose names Brynn would later learn were Halden, Nash, and a younger guard called Perrin who looked considerably less certain about the whole affair than the rest. Well, Tobias said, blocking her path with his arms folded, teeth bared in something that was not quite a smile. "Heard you've got a smart mouth for the Lady Odessa. Thought maybe it was time somebody taught you some manners." Brynn set down her water buckets very slowly. "I already have manners," she said. "I simply reserve them for people who deserve them." Fenric laughed, an ugly sound. "Careful," he said. "She might bite." "I might," Brynn agreed. Tobias stepped closer, and that was, in the end, his mistake, because it put him within arm's reach, and 11 years of a dead man's training had taught Brynn precisely what to do with a man within arm's reach. She still tried to walk away first. She wanted that understood, later, by anyone who asked. She stepped sideways, tried to move past him toward the servant's door, and it was only when Tobias grabbed her wrist, hard enough to bruise, and yanked her back around, that something in her, held in check for 11 long years, finally, quietly, broke. "Let go of me," she said, and her voice had gone very calm, very flat, in a way that should have warned him. Or what, he said, laughing, and pulled her closer. Brynn moved. It was not elegant, not at first, because 11 years of secret practice in a cramped servant's quarters was not the same as a real fight against a trained guard nearly twice her size. But it was fast, and it was precise, and it targeted every single weakness her father's manual had ever taught her to find in a larger opponent. She broke Tobias's grip with a twist that should have been impossible for someone her size, drove her elbow into his throat hard enough to send him staggering, and had already turned to face Fenric before Tobias hit the ground, choking. "What?" Fenric started to say, and never finished the sentence, because Brynn's foot connected with the side of his knee and folded it in a direction knees were not built to fold. Halden came at her with a drawn blade, and here, finally, the fight became something the others could actually see happening, something too fast and too real to laugh at anymore. Brynn ducked under his swing, caught his wrist, and used his own momentum to put him face first into the stone wall of the courtyard. Nash grabbed her from behind, arms locking around her shoulders, and she drove her head back into his nose with a crunch that echoed off the courtyard walls, then flipped him bodily over her hip the way her father's manual had described in careful, patient handwriting she had read 1,000 times by candlelight. Perrin, the youngest, dropped his sword entirely and put both hands up before she ever reached him. "I yield," he said, voice cracking. "I yield, I never wanted, I yield." Brynn stood in the center of the courtyard, chest heaving, knuckles split, surrounded by 4 groaning men and one thoroughly terrified one, and became aware, in the sudden, ringing silence, that the courtyard door had opened. Alpha King Roran stood in the doorway in his sleeping clothes, a sword half drawn from the sound of the commotion, staring at the wreckage of his personal guard with an expression Brynn had never seen on him before and could not begin to read. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Tobias, still on the ground, still choking, managed to raise one shaking arm and point at her. "She attacked us, my king," he wheezed. "Unprovoked. She's dangerous. She should be in chains." Brynn opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, because 11 years of careful silence was a hard habit to break even now, even standing in the wreckage of everything she'd spent her whole life hiding. Roran's eyes moved slowly across the courtyard. 4 grown, trained guards on the ground. 1 girl standing. He looked, for a long moment, at Brynn's split knuckles, at the bruise already forming on her wrist where Tobias had grabbed her, and Brynn watched something calculate behind his eyes, cold and fast, the way she imagined a king had to calculate everything, always, whether he wanted to or not. "Is this true?" he said finally, his voice carefully level. "Did you attack 5 of my guards unprovoked?" Brynn looked at him, and for one long moment, considered lying, the way she had lied about everything her entire life. "No," she said instead. "Your guard captain grabbed me, and I defended myself. That is the entire truth of it, my king, and I will not apologize for it, whatever you decide to do with me." The silence that followed was the longest of Brynn's life. Chapter 5. By law, Caldwith's rule was simple and unbending. No wolf raised a hand against another within the walls of the hold unless sanctioned by formal combat, and any wolf who broke that rule, regardless of rank or reason, answered to the Alpha King directly. Brynn had broken that law in front of a dozen witnesses. The fact that she had broken it defending herself against 5 armed men did not, by the strict letter of Caldwith's code, change the outcome, and Roran, standing in his own courtyard at midnight surrounded by groaning guards and a furious, gathering crowd, understood with grim clarity that everyone was now watching to see exactly what he would do about it. Garen arrived within minutes, taking the scene with the flat, calculating look of a man already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. "My king," he said quietly, pulling Roran aside. "Whatever the truth of this, half the hold is already watching. If you let an Omega walk free after putting 5 guards on the ground, you will have every ambitious wolf in this territory testing that same boundary within the month. You know this." "I know it," Roran said, jaw tight. "And if you execute her outright for defending herself against an unprovoked assault by your own men," Garen continued, "you will have every Omega and every powerless wolf in this hold believing your justice only ever runs in one direction. That is not a message you can afford to send either, not with everything else currently unraveling around you." Roran said nothing for a long moment, staring at the girl standing rigid and silent in the center of his courtyard, blood on her knuckles, chin lifted, refusing to beg even now. "Then give me a third option," he said quietly, "because apparently those are the only 2 you're offering me." Garen studied him for a moment, then allowed himself something close to a thin smile. "There is one," he said. "Declare her wanted, not for execution, but for formal judgment before the full pack council. It buys time. It satisfies the guard's pride publicly. And it keeps her alive long enough for someone," he added, with the particular delicacy of a man choosing his next words very carefully, to determine whether there is more to this girl than anyone currently understands. Roran looked at Garen for a long moment, a look that said, quite clearly, that he understood exactly what his beta was suggesting and did not entirely disagree with it. "Brynn," he said finally, turning back to the courtyard, his voice carrying easily across the silent crowd. "By the law of this hold, you have broken combat code within these walls. I am declaring you wanted for formal judgment before the Pack Council. Until such time as you are found and brought before that council, you are to be considered a fugitive of Cauldrith Hold." Brynn's stomach dropped. "My king," she started. "Run, Brynn," he said, so quietly that only she, standing closest, could hear it beneath the noise of the gathering crowd. His eyes held hers for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. "Run, and do not let my guards catch you before I have decided what to do with all of this." It was, Brynn would realize much later, the strangest mercy she had ever been offered, delivered in the same breath as a formal declaration that had just made her the most hunted woman in the Northern Hold. She ran. Chapter 6. The forests beyond Cauldrith Hold were ancient, dense, and entirely unforgiving to anyone who did not know them well, which was precisely why Brynn had spent several quiet years learning every trail within a day's run of the walls, back when she still believed that one day she might need to run for reasons far less dramatic than this. She survived the first week on stubbornness and stolen bread. She survived the second on the very specific fury of a woman who had spent 11 years being told she was worthless and had finally, publicly, proven otherwise, only to be punished for it. Roran's guards, under Garen's careful, unhurried direction, searched for her with a thoroughness that felt, to Brynn, suspiciously incomplete. Patrols came close and then, inexplicably, turned back. Search parties combed forests 2 valleys over from where she actually hid. It was almost, she thought more than once, as though someone wanted her found slowly rather than quickly, and it took her longer than she would have liked to consider the possibility that the someone in question might be the king himself. She found out for certain on the 11th night, when Roran found her alone, without guards, sitting by a small fire she had been careless enough to light. "You're a difficult woman to track," he said, stepping out of the tree line with his hands visibly empty, no sword drawn. Brynn was on her feet instantly, a knife in her hand that had not been there a heartbeat earlier.
"You shouldn't have come alone," she said. "I didn't want an audience," Warren said.
Which, given the audience present the last time we spoke, seemed wise. Brynn studied him for a long moment, knife still raised. "Are you here to arrest me, my king, or to finish what your guard started?" "Neither," Warren said. "I'm here because I have spent 11 days asking myself an extremely uncomfortable question, and I think you are the only person who can actually answer it."
"What question is that?"
"Where did an Omega kitchen girl with no family and no name learn to put 5 trained guards on the ground in under a minute?" he said, and something in his voice was quieter now, less king, and more simply a man who had been awake too many nights turning over a puzzle he could not solve. "And why exactly have you spent 11 years hiding it?" Brynn lowered the knife, slowly, though she did not put it away. "Sit down, then," she said finally, "if you actually want the truth of it, my king. It's a long story, and I imagine you've had a long 11 days. Warren sat. It was, Brynn would think much later, the first entirely honest conversation she had ever had with anyone in Caldrith Hold, and it happened, of all places, over a stolen campfire, with a bounty on her head and a king who had personally declared her a fugitive sitting close enough to touch. She told him about the fire, about the woman who had pressed the leather bundle into her hands and told her to run, about 11 years of training in secret by candlelight from a dead man's handwriting, because some quiet, stubborn part of her had always known that the day would come when she needed it. "I don't know who my father was," she admitted finally, staring into the flames rather than at him. "Not his name, not his rank, nothing beyond the fact that whatever he taught it to be used against people larger and stronger than the one fighting them." Which suggests, she added, with a dry, humorless laugh, that he expected me to spend my whole life fighting people larger and stronger than me. He was not wrong. Warren was quiet for a long moment. "May I see it?" he said finally. "The manual." Brynn hesitated, then reached into the satchel she had not let out of her sight in 11 days, and handed it over. Warren studied the pages by firelight for a long time, his expression growing steadily stranger, until finally he looked up at her with something that was not quite disbelief and not quite recognition, but sat uncomfortably close to both. "Brynn," he said slowly, "do you know whose crest this is, pressed into the leather binding?"
"No," she said.
"I never learned to read crests. Omegas aren't taught. It's House Renmore," Warren said quietly. "A noble bloodline from the Western Territories, wiped out in a border war 19 years ago, save for one detail the official records never quite explained. There was a child, a daughter. Nobody ever found her." Brynn stared at him across the fire and felt the ground shift very quietly beneath everything she had ever believed about herself. Chapter 7. The revelation did not solve anything. If anything, it made everything considerably more complicated, because a missing noble heir with a legitimate, if distant, claim to territory currently held by allies of Caldrith was not simply an interesting historical footnote. It was a political weapon, and the moment word of it reached the wrong ears, Brynn's life would become worth considerably more dead than the modest bounty currently on her head. Which was, Warren realized with a cold, sinking certainty as he sat by that fire turning the pages of a dead man's training manual, very possibly the entire point of everything that had happened over the past 6 months. "The Thornvale conspiracy," he said slowly, thinking aloud. "The poison wells. The missing shipments. All of it aimed at destabilizing me, at making me look weak and distracted, right around the same time an Omega girl with a hidden noble bloodline happens to reveal a set of fighting skills nobody could explain. That is not a coincidence. Someone wanted this exact moment to happen. Brynn frowned. You think someone engineered this? Engineered Tobias attacking me. I think, Warren said carefully, that someone has spent 6 months creating exactly the kind of chaos that would make it easy to bury a very inconvenient discovery underneath a very public scandal. An Omega revealed to be dangerous, declared a fugitive, hunted, and quietly eliminated in the forest, while the Hold's attention stays fixed entirely on guards and combat law and gossip. Nobody would ever think to ask who benefits from House Renmore's last heir disappearing permanently, this time for good. Brynn's blood went cold.
Who would benefit from that?
Warren did not answer immediately, and in his silence, Brynn watched him arrive at a name he clearly did not want to say out loud. Garen, he said finally quietly. My own beta stood to gain more from your death than almost anyone else in this hold, because House Renmore's territorial claim, should it ever be formally revived, sits directly across land his own family has quietly absorbed over the past 2 decades. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the dark forest beyond, an owl called once and fell silent. Then we have a considerably larger problem than a bounty, Brynn said slowly, than either of us being hunted by your guards. Yes, Warren agreed. We do. There is a version of this conversation, Brynn said after a moment, with a particular dry humor that had gotten her in trouble her entire life, in which I point out that 6 months ago you personally declared me a wanted fugitive, and now you're asking me to help you save your entire hold from a conspiracy run by your own second-in-command. I feel that deserves at least a small amount of acknowledgement. Warren actually laughed at that, briefly, and looked younger for it, less like a king carrying a decade of grief and more like a man who had simply forgotten, for one unguarded moment, how tired he was.
Duly acknowledged, he said.
For what it's worth, revoking a bounty is considerably easier than convincing a pack council that my own beta has been quietly orchestrating a conspiracy for 6 months with no proof beyond a very good guess and a dead man's training manual. Then we'd better find proof, Brynn said, and something in her voice, steady and certain in a way 11 years of silence had never allowed her to be, made Warren look at her for a long moment across the firelight with an expression she did not entirely understand yet, though she would come to recognize it, weeks later, as the particular look of a man realizing he had badly underestimated someone he was rapidly, helplessly starting to admire. Chapter 8. They moved carefully after that, because careless movement, they both understood, was exactly what had gotten Brynn hunted in the first place. Warren returned to Caldrith alone the next morning, careful to maintain every appearance that the search for the fugitive Omega continued exactly as it had before. Behind that appearance, however, he began quietly pulling at every thread of the Thornvale conspiracy with new eyes, this time looking specifically for Garen's fingerprints rather than assuming, as he had for 6 months, that his own beta was simply a trusted ally, helping him investigate a mystery neither of them understood. It was Sable, of all people, who provided the first real piece of proof, though she did not know it at the time. I saw something strange, she told Brynn during one of their careful, dangerous late-night meetings at the forest's edge, weeks into Brynn's exile. One of the Border Patrol wolves, drunk in the tavern, bragging about coin he'd been paid to look the other way during a supply run last month. Said his contact was someone high up, someone with access to the treasury logs. I didn't think much of it until I heard what happened to you. Did he say a name? Brynn asked. Sable shook her head.
No.
But he said the coin had House Renmore's old crest stamped into it, melted down from something older. Said it was strange. seeing an extinct house's mark on modern coin. Brynn went very still. "That's not strange," she said slowly. "That's someone laundering old House Renmore treasury reserves that should have been seized 19 years ago and were instead quietly redirected somewhere they were never supposed to go." When she relayed this to Roran 2 nights later, his expression darkened considerably. "Garen oversees the treasury archives personally," he said. "Has for years. Nobody ever questioned it, because nobody had reason to." "They have reason now," Brynn said. The proof, once they knew precisely where to look, came together faster than either of them expected, though not without cost. A hidden ledger, recovered from an abandoned Renmore holding by Brynn herself, using knowledge of the Western territories that, she realized with a strange, disorienting pang, must have come from some deep, half-buried childhood memory she had never consciously accessed. A pattern of coin transfers, stretching back nearly 2 decades, that traced a quiet, careful campaign of land acquisition disguised as ordinary border administration. And finally, damningly, a letter in Garen's own handwriting, intercepted by one of Roran's few remaining trusted guards, discussing, quote, the Renmore problem and how fortunate it was that the girl's own recklessness had solved it for them. Roran read that letter 3 times before he trusted himself to speak. "He tried to have you killed in that forest without ever lifting a finger himself," he said finally, voice tight with a fury Brynn had not seen from him before. "Sent search parties he knew would fail on purpose, hoping you'd starve, or freeze, or simply disappear, all while letting me believe I was the one protecting you by declaring you a fugitive instead of executing you outright." "Well," Brynn said, with the dark, dry humor that she had learned over these strange weeks, was the only way she knew how to hold fear at arm's length. "I suppose I should thank him for underestimating exactly how stubborn I am." Roran did not laugh this time. He looked at her instead with an intensity that made her chest go tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear at all. "I am done underestimating you," he said quietly. "I should never have started." Chapter 9. The Pack Council convened 8 days later, summoned by Roran himself under the pretense of finally rendering formal judgment on the fugitive Omega Brynn, exactly as the law required. What the assembled elders and border lords did not expect was that judgment would be rendered not against her, but against the Betas standing quietly at the king's right hand. The great hall was fuller than Brynn had ever seen it, every bench packed, every eye fixed on her as she was brought forward in chains, exactly as spectacle demanded, exactly as Garen himself had quietly requested weeks earlier, believing it would be the final act of a story he had authored from the shadows. Odessa, seated near the front with an expression of poorly concealed satisfaction, leaned toward the lord beside her and murmured something that made him smile. Roran stood, and the hall fell silent. "We are gathered," he began, his voice carrying easily across the packed hall, "to render judgment on Brynn, formerly of this Holt's Kitchens, accused of breaking combat law by attacking 5 of my guards without provocation." A murmur ran through the crowd. Garen, standing at Roran's side, allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. However, Roran continued, "Before we proceed to that judgment, I find myself obligated to address a separate matter, one considerably more urgent to the safety of this entire hold. The matter of who has spent the last 6 months poisoning wells, redirecting treasury coin, and orchestrating a campaign of chaos designed specifically to distract this council from a conspiracy taking place within its own walls." Garen's satisfied expression flickered, just slightly. "I would like," Roran said, turning to face his beta directly for the first time, "to ask Garen a question, in front of this entire council. Would you care to explain, old friend, why a letter in your own handwriting refers to quote the Renmore problem and its convenient resolution, weeks before that resolution was supposed to occur? The color drained from Garen's face in real time, visible to the entire hall. My king, he began, I don't know what letter you're referring to. This one, Roran said, and Brynn, still in chains, watched him produce the folded paper and hand it to the nearest council elder, who read it with visibly growing alarm. The hall erupted into noise. Garen's eyes darted toward the exits, calculating, and found every one of them already quietly blocked by guards who had, unbeknownst to him, spent the previous week being carefully, individually informed of the truth by Roran himself. You cannot prove any of this actually connects to me, Garen said, voice rising, a note of genuine panic beneath the practiced calm. Actually, Brynn said, speaking for the first time since being led into the hall, her voice cutting cleanly through the noise. We can, because I recovered the treasury ledger myself, from the Renmore holding your family has been quietly farming for the better part of 2 decades. Every head in the hall turned toward her. I believe, she continued, chains rattling slightly as she lifted her chin, that makes me considerably less of a fugitive and considerably more of an inconvenient witness you very badly wanted removed before I could ever stand in front of this council and say exactly what I am about to say. My name, as far as any of us can currently prove, is Brynn of House Renmore, last surviving heir of a bloodline your family has spent 19 years quietly erasing for profit. The hall went utterly, completely silent. Garen broke first, exactly as men like him always did once the silence grew too heavy to bear. He lunged, not toward the exit, but toward Brynn herself, a hidden blade appearing in his hand with the speed of a man who had clearly planned for this exact possibility. He never reached her. Roran moved faster, closing the distance between them in a single, brutal motion, and the fight that followed lasted exactly as long as it takes a desperate, cornered man to realize he has badly misjudged an opponent who has spent 10 years training specifically to survive assassination attempts. It ended with Garen on the floor of the great hall, disarmed, restrained, and considerably less composed than he had been at the start of the proceedings. Brynn, for her part, watched the entire exchange with the particular calm of a woman who had already spent this exact evening rehearsing 5 separate ways she might have handled it herself, and felt, for the first time in 11 years, something close to relief. Chapter 10. Garen's trial, when it came, was considerably shorter and considerably less merciful than the one initially planned for Brynn. The evidence, once properly assembled, left little room for argument, and the council, having narrowly avoided being made complicit in 19 years of quiet theft and attempted murder, showed no particular appetite for leniency. Brynn's chains, meanwhile, were removed within the hour, though the formal restoration of House Renmore's name and territory took considerably longer, tangled as it was in 19 years of legal complications that even Roran's most patient advisors found exhausting to untangle. I have decided, Roran told her, some weeks later, on an evening considerably calmer than any they had shared since that first stolen campfire, that formal titles move slower than almost anything else in this hold, including, apparently, my own patience. Brynn, seated across from him in a study that had, in recent weeks, become an unofficial meeting place for the two of them, raised an eyebrow. Is that your version of an apology for how long the paperwork is taking? It is my version of admitting that I would like to stop waiting for paperwork before saying something I have wanted to say for several weeks now, Roran said. Brynn set down the book she had been pretending to read.
Go on, then.
Warren, who had faced down conspirators, assassins, and 11 years of grinding political pressure without once losing his composure, found himself, in that particular moment, considerably less composed than usual. "I called you an inconvenient discovery once," he said. "Privately, to myself, the night I first watched you train in that kitchen, and could not stop thinking about it for reasons that had nothing to do with the conspiracy I was supposed to be worried about." "That is," Brynn said, fighting a smile, "possibly the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "I'm working up to the romantic part," Warren said dryly. "Give me a moment. I am considerably better at declaring war on conspirators than declaring feelings, as it turns out." Brynn laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded in a way 11 years of careful invisibility had never once allowed her to be in this castle. "I've noticed," she said. "It's oddly endearing, watching a king fumble through something a kitchen girl could say in half the words." "Then perhaps," Warren said, closing the distance between them, "you should simply say it for me." Brynn looked up at him for a long moment, at the man who had once declared her a fugitive and then, in the same breath, told her to run, at the man who had sat by a stolen fire and asked her the truth instead of simply passing judgment, at the man who had spent weeks treating her not as an Omega, not as a rediscovered heir, but simply, finally, as herself. "I think," she said quietly, "that I have spent 11 years being told I could not fight and 6 months proving every single person who said it badly wrong. I think I am done being underestimated. And I think," she added, allowing herself, finally, the kind of open honesty she had spent her entire life too afraid to offer anyone, "that I would very much like to stop pretending I don't feel the exact same way about you that you're currently failing to say about me." Warren laughed then, low and genuine, and closed the last of the distance between them. The kingdom, in the months that followed, adjusted itself slowly to a new and considerably more complicated reality. House Renmore was formally restored, its territory quietly returned through negotiations that took the better part of a year. Odessa departed Caldrith Hold within weeks of the trial, her ambitions considerably deflated, though she was, by all accounts, gracious enough about it that nobody held much of a grudge. Sable, who had spent 11 years believing her closest friend simply did not sleep well, was given the singular honor of being the very first person Brynn told the entire truth to, all of it, over an entire bottle of wine that took considerably longer to finish than either of them expected given how much talking there was to do. And in the training yard where 5 guards had once mocked an Omega who supposedly could not fight, Brynn returned, months later, not as a fugitive and not as a kitchen girl, but as Lady Renmore, teaching a small, carefully selected group of Caldrith's Omegas the forms her father had once written down for a daughter he hoped might never need them, and had been, in the end, entirely right to teach her anyway. "An Omega who can't fight," she told her first small class, standing in the same courtyard where her entire life had once changed in under a minute, "is simply an Omega nobody has bothered to teach properly yet. I intend to fix that particular oversight, one stubborn student at a time." Tobias, who had survived his broken throat and considerably more broken pride, watched from a distance, said nothing, and never once made the joke again.